Thanks, Jessica, for handing it off to me. Thanks, everyone, for joining us for part 1 of 6 of the KFAN advocacy series. I am just tickled to be able to introduce Sheila Schuster, Dr. Sheila Schuster, to y'all today. Before I get to the full and lengthy introduction with all of her accolades, I just want to say Sheila has always been a great mentor to, I know, me and probably countless other, I don't even want to say advocates, because I feel like you've been a mentor to so many, but I just want to personally say thank you for coming here, sharing your wisdom, and being a mentor to so many over the years. So Dr. Schuster is a licensed psychologist and mental health advocate who has spent over 4 decades working in Frankfurt. This is your 43rd session, not including special sessions, is that right?
44th coming up. Started in 1978. I was only 10, so I'm young.
Yeah. So Dr. Schuster, has been working on a number of issues, but especially around improving services for folks living with mental illness and other disabilities and increasing healthcare access across Kentucky. I believe you were in clinical practice for 27 years.
Right. I last stopped practicing in 2000. So I've been doing the full-time work in Frankfurt and around the state since 2000.
Even though Dr. Schuster is no longer clinically practicing, I know for a fact people still call you and ask you for advice and guidance. So I guess that's volunteer work at this point. But
absolutely.
Sheila also leads the Advocacy Action Network, an umbrella organization that includes groups addressing healthcare, mental health, social justice, and disability justice. Dr. Schuster is also the chair for Kentucky Voices for Health, a coalition to improve health outcomes in Kentucky, and leads the Kentucky Mental Health Coalition, which I think is up to over 80 organizations now.
Celebrating our 40th birthday in April. Some of my gray hair comes from holding coalitions together. We'll talk about that as a strategy.
And then let's see. Also, you chair the Behavioral Health Technical Assistance (TAC) for the Kentucky's Medicaid program, and Sheila does a really good job of bringing directly impacted voices into those technical advisory committees. Sheila is, again, like I said, she's been around, seen a lot of great wisdom, often helps lead trainings like these. So I'm excited for her to bring her wisdom and expertise to you all. And Sheila, I will pass it over to you to take it away.
Okay, thank you so much, Tyler. I appreciate that. And let me share my screen, which is always an iffy proposition with me. Whoops, see, I've messed up already. Wait a minute. There it is. Okay, we are ready to go. And thank you. I love doing these workshops, trainings, webinars, whatever you want to call them. So let me tell you where we're going to go on this little trip together. We'll start out.
Dr. Schuster, sorry, I don't mean to interrupt.
Am I muted?
No, you're not muted. I am not seeing your presentation, so I just want to make, I'm not sure if that's.
Is that nobody seeing it except me?
I see it. Well, until you moved it.
Okay, let's try this again. Oh.
There it is. Beautiful.
Okay. All right. Thank you. So we'll start out with all the reasons why I think you should be an advocate or want to be an advocate. And part of it is that you've already joined this great group and want to learn more about advocacy. So I'm going to take that as a very positive sign. Then we're going to talk about the nuts and bolts of how a bill becomes a law. And along the way, we'll talk about some of the pitfalls, some of the ways you can get off track or off the road. I want to equip you with some advice about the best ways to talk with policymakers. And we're going to concentrate on legislators in Frankfurt, but I think all of these are actually applicable to any place where you want to do advocacy. So they would work obviously at the federal level. They also would work at the local level. So if you're doing work with your local Board of Health, let's say, or with your local Metro Council or any of those kinds of groups, I think these same skills will hopefully make your voice more effective, make your voice count. So I do really encourage you to put questions in the chat and we'll try to answer those. I always say to people, there really is no such thing as a dumb question. So if I'm mentioning something or talking about something that doesn't make a lot of sense to you, or you want some clarification, please, put something in the chat and we'll go from there. I want you to think about, usually when I'm face-to-face, I'll start with people, how many of you have ever been to Frankfurt? Maybe you could put that in the chat, just yes, yes, no, so we get some idea. And I guess the other question that I would have you thinking about, or if you want to put something in the chat, what's the thing would be the scariest for you in talking with a policymaker, with a legislator? Because I want to be sure that I, particularly as a psychologist, try to assuage those fears or anxieties. So if you might put some of that in the chat as we go along, I want to be sure that I kind of touch on all those things. So this is our Capitol. It's really a very lovely place, not very accessible for people with disabilities, I will have to say that. So we've got about 10,000 folks out here, and I always say to people, what group do you think this is? And of course, I always wish that it were psychologists. I'm not sure we even have 10,000 psychologists in the state. The biggest group that we have probably are the nurses. There's about 88,000 nurses in Kentucky. This particular group, if you've guessed correctly, are teachers. And this is not during the pension of the last couple of sessions. This was way back in the Governor Ernie Fletcher administration, when there were big changes going on, even about who was going to qualify as a teacher, not just about the pension. And I will point out that teachers have a secret weapon that the rest of us don't have. And that is that they can often get their superintendents to call off school, and then they commandeer the school buses. So they can bring lots of folks to Frankfurt fairly easily, where the rest of us have to carpool and do other things. Numbers are important. And one of the things I want you to think about is how you can engage more people, because certainly volume helps, but there are also ways of getting legislators' attention without having 10,000 people in the Capitol. So what is advocacy? My definition is advocacy is education with passion. So I'm going to assume that you have passion. I'm going to assume that you have passion around food security, around producing food, processing it, making it safe, making it available. You probably have other things that you're passionate about. What I have found is that we are more effective advocates when we are advocating about things about which we feel passionately. So an advocate is one who listens. And one of the things I want you to think about as we go along is, whose voice are you trying to convey when you're in Frankfurt or when you're talking to a policymaker? Who are those folks, whether they're the farmers, whether they're your fellow community folks who are living in a food desert, who are those voices? An advocate is one who connects, and one of the ways to build more volume, if you will, is to work in coalition, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. So think about who are some maybe unlikely folks that you might get interested. If you're an advocate, you've got to be willing to speak up and to act. And so a lot of times, and we'll look at what you've put in the chat, those are the things that kind of give people pause. What am I going to say to a legislator? What if they ask me a question I don't know the answer to? How do I take action? So an advocate is, again, anyone who has a passion about an issue or about people. So this is one of my groups. This is the 874K Disability Coalition. At one of our events, we used to do these over in the convention center in Frankfurt every 4th year when there was a gubernatorial election. 874K stands for 874,000 Kentuckians who have a disability that interferes with some task of daily living. So that's 23% of our population. It's probably greater than that because the census does not count kids under 5. I don't know why. We have kids that are born with known disabilities. Also does not count Kentuckians who are already in some kind of institution like a nursing home or an intermediate care facility. So I've been working with this coalition for this coming year will be our 22nd event, and they're wonderful days in Frankfurt. I always invite people. I'm sure that Tyler and Jessica have been up there when we have 700 to 800 people up there with disabilities, and they're advocates, their family members, their providers. And I love it because they clog up the hallways and the dining room, and they show how inaccessible our Capitol and Annex are. And we do this to do something that I think is super important in advocacy, and that is to put a face on the problem. So I want legislators, when they vote on a budget, to not just be voting on a number. I want them to think about any of these folks that they've talked to, that they've seen in the hallways, that need funding for services and supports. So it's got to be the voice of the people, and if our democracy is going to work. So this is kind of my therapy slide. If I were seeing you in a treatment situation and you kept coming in week after week talking about the same situation and how awful it made you feel, or how terrified it made you feel, or whatever, at some point I'm going to be working with you and saying, you know, at some point you're going to have to make a decision. You can either choose to continue to be a victim of that situation, or you can choose to try to do something to influence it. So I'm not saying that everything that happens in Frankfurt is necessarily a bad thing and that we're a victim always of bad things, but there are some things that happen or don't happen in Frankfurt that really are not good. And we can decide whether we're just going to let that happen, or we can decide that we can do something about it. So I hope as we go along, you're going to feel more confident and more empowered, and have some skills to do something about it, to influence that system. So we know that advocacy works, and I'm going to take you through Civics 101 in a sense. So the legislators are elected by you, so they're elected to serve you. So if you hesitate to call your representative or your senator, you're really doing yourself and them a disservice. They are elected in your House district where you live, or in your Senate district, which is about 3 times as big. So the House members represent about 41,000 Kentuckians. The senators represent roughly 125,000 Kentuckians. You have every right to contact them, not at midnight and not when you're fiery mad. Don't tell them Dr. Schuster said to call at midnight and cuss them out. But you do have every responsibility and right to contact them. The governor is elected by you, whether you voted for Governor Beshear or not, whether you voted for Governor Bevin 4 years ago or 3 years ago or not. That governor is elected by the people. So the governor and the entire executive branch, and by that we mean the cabinet and all of the departments, are there to serve you. Again, you have every right as a citizen of this state, represented by that governor and by that executive branch, by those legislators, to raise your voice. So a democracy only works if the voice of the people can be heard, and we cannot hold them accountable unless we've told them what we need. They can do lots of things, but they are not mind readers. So just because we have an issue, we have something that we're passionate about, if we've never opened our mouths or sent an email or written a letter or put in a call to the message line, then we really cannot hold them accountable for not doing anything to help solve the issue that is bugging us or is making life difficult for people. So this is my guilt slide. I will confess to being raised Catholic, and there's a lot of guilt sometimes in the Catholic religion. So this is the, if you don't do it, who will? This again is one of our 874K gatherings in the convention center when it was still there. We would have about 1,000 people there, and we would see people at tables with their legislators. And we wanted, again, those legislators to be face to face with people with disabilities so they could better understand what barriers there were to their being fully a member of the community. So who understands the issues better than you do? Whose voice will be heard if yours isn't heard? So I always worry about, I sometimes find myself fighting insurance companies, for instance, because they don't always want to pay for services that I think people need. Sometimes I end up fighting with the Medicaid department for that reason. And I always think if I don't raise my voice, then they're not hearing about the needs that are out there that are unmet. So I really try to pay attention to that. So here's some reasons why I think that voice should be yours. We're going to talk about why it's about policy and not about politics. I think people that get into advocacy around purely political, I want to make the Republicans look good, or I want to make the Republicans look bad, or I want to make the Democrats look good or bad, are not really good advocates. They may be good politicians or political hangers-on, but we're really talking about policy. The politics is important because we understand how much that influences what gets done, but we're really focused on a change in the way things are done. Again, I'm going to assume that you really care about your issues and that you care passionately and that you're knowledgeable about them and that you try to provide accurate and important information. Without looking at the chat yet, I'm going to guess that at least some of you said the thing that scares me the most, because this is what I hear the most from people I talk with about advocacy, I'm really afraid that I'm going to be meeting with a legislator, maybe even my own legislator, and they're going to ask me a question. I'm not going to know the answer to it. Happens to me all the time, and I've been doing this for a lot of years. I can think that I'm so prepared and that I've really tried to look at the issue and our proposed solution from all different angles. But inevitably, a legislator, and sometimes they'll do it to kind of throw you a curveball. They do it with me because they know me. With you all, it's often a very honest question. You may be in there with your talking points and things that you've worked with Tyler and Jessica and Natalie about. You've got your issue that you're going to talk to them about. You have your leave behind. We're going to talk about that. And in the middle of it, they ask you a question. They say, you know, what's the budget impact of this? Or very often they'll say, well, who's opposed to it? Because they want to know what the landmines are out there. What you don't want to do, no matter how good you are at it, you don't want to pull an answer out of your left ear. I don't care if you were the best BSer on your essay exams at school or anything else. You don't want to make up an answer because you want to be a trustworthy source of information. And I actually think that if you get asked a question by a legislator that you don't know the answer to, it is a wonderful opportunity to come back around and get a second bite at the apple. So what you really want to do is to say, oh, Representative so-and-so, that is a great question, and I don't know the answer to that. Let me do this. Let me go back to the people I'm working with and get you an answer. Now, how should I get back in touch with you to make sure you get the information? And very often a legislator at that point will say, here's my card, it's got my cell phone on it. Or here's my card, it's got a different email address so that you don't email me through the LRC, the Legislative Research Commission, because I get thousands of emails sometimes. Or here's somebody I'm working with on this in the office. And if you get them the information, but it gives you that kind of access back to them. And then for goodness sake, follow through. They will remember you if you go and do your homework and get back with them. If you can't answer their questions, still get back with them. You could say, you asked me about what the budget impact is. And as hard as we've tried, we're not going to know that until the Legislative Research Commission Budget Committee does that analysis. As soon as we have heard that they've done it, I will let you know. Or here's the best answer that we can get based on what's happened in other states, or whatever the issue is. The other thing is that if you're working with a group that has a lobbyist, which actually I'm a registered lobbyist, you could say to them, we work with Sheila Schuster, she's a lobbyist up here. I said, okay, if she gets back to you with the information, because I'm up there every day, I'm talking to legislators every day. The advantage to me as a lobbyist, I may know that legislator, but if that legislator knows that I know you as a constituent, that gives me another entree, another opportunity to speak with that legislator. So that's something else that you can do. Or if you've got the director of your agency, you can do it that way. But don't not go. do not hesitate to contact a legislator because you think that they might ask you something. There are a lot of unanswered questions in Frankfurt, actually. You also have access to what we call the free media. And by that, I mean, I've never had the pleasure of working with any group that had enough money to buy media, to do radio spots or TV spots, or, put things on billboards or whatever. But if you notice, even television, even radio, but certainly the newspapers, when they write about an issue, they want to put a face on it. They want to interview somebody or several people that this issue has affected. So if you are working with people that have that kind of story, you're going to have access to the quote free media. And the more access you have, the better drumbeat there is around your story. You can rally grassroots support. In other words, you could reach out within your network of a food action network, as well as with other people, and get the word out. You can engage in coalitions, and we'll talk about how you do that. And again, you're willing to speak up. Well, let's see. Okay. The other thing is, hopefully you're all registered to vote. Really important in these days of partisan politics. Legislators check on that. If we do a postcard campaign or we have a sign-on campaign, I will get feedback from legislators. I had these people contact me. They said they lived in my district, and they do, but none of them are registered to vote. So why is that important? Because you as a constituent have the ability to vote to keep that representative or senator in their office, or to vote them out. And they know that. Or if they decide to run for a different office, they will assume that you know them, and hopefully that you've had a good experience with them. Again, you have that power of the ballot box. I only have that for one representative and for one senator. So while I may know a lot of them and they may listen to me, I don't have the same power that you do as a constituent. So one of the things that I think all of us advocates need to be doing is making sure that people are registered to vote. And we know that one of the tactics being used nationally is to make it harder for certain populations of people to vote. So we want to work to overcome that and make sure that everyone knows that they have the opportunity to vote and has the ability to do that. So here are some of the things that I think will help you to be effective. One is to understand the process of policy making, which we're going to talk about. How do you identify your policy makers? How do you know who your state senator and state representative are? How do you know who's on a certain committee that you're going to be talking to? You want to be able to specify your goals. And sometimes in terms of strategy, we decide that our big ask is too big to try to go after in one session. And we may take some piece of it and do that as a first step. That's not an unknown strategy. The good news is that sometimes it's easier to pass a smaller piece than a larger piece. The downside to that is that when you come back the next session to do the next piece, very often a legislator will say, hey, I thought we passed your bill last time. And you say, well, you did. You passed this piece of it. Now we need this piece. So, it's something that you and your group will have to decide how big a bite of the apple, so to speak, do you want to try to get in your legislation going forward. You want to know the time frame. Are we in a 30-day session or are we in a 60-day session? Where are we in the session in terms of deadlines? Do we have time to move this bill out of the House chamber and still have time for it to pass in the Senate or vice versa? You need to engage others in the fight. It's rare, it sometimes happens that one extremely passionate person can carry the ball. It happened actually 2 sessions ago. A mom with a daughter who had an eating disorder and was actually in danger of dying from this eating disorder, got engaged with a very powerful legislator, Senator Julie Rocky Adams from Louisville, who's in leadership in the Senate, around the fact that we had almost no services, no treatment for eating disorders. And she took that fight to Frankfurt. I talked with her many times and met one-on-one with every legislator who would talk to her. And she had such a powerful personal story. It was her daughter she was fighting for. And occasionally her daughter was well enough to be able to come to Frankfurt to speak up. But that mom got that bill passed in one session to establish an eating disorders council that could bring together recommendations and had all kinds of input and so forth. It's rare, and my hat's off to anyone, but it takes that kind of just absolutely fire in the belly. I'm not going to stop until I can do this. I think the little bit easier fight is, and she had other people. I don't mean that she was the only one that was supporting it. She gathered people, and for instance, the Mental Health Coalition sent out tons of action alerts for it, and we had lots of calls generated, but she really spearheaded that as a single person. Prepared to play defense as well as offense, and certainly Tyler and Jessica and Natalie understand that. Sometimes the biggest victories at the end of a session are that we stop 2 really bad bills. And we might not have passed any of the things we had on our pass, on our offense, but it may have been well worth it to have concentrated on defense.
Sheila, if
Yeah.
I can add to that, I know, at least for me, it's easy for me to be pessimistic. So it's easy for me to assume we'll need to be on the defense, right? But that piece about offense and, be prepared to win as much as you prepare to lose. I feel like I've learned that lesson. Well, maybe I still haven't, because I've learned it more than once, but sometimes the stars align, to Sheila's point, and you have the right messenger and you've got the right sponsor and you've got the right conditions on the ground. And, and that can happen. And that's, I think it's important to, I don't want to say be your own worst enemy, but sometimes my pessimism gets in my own way. So yes, there's a lot of defensive fights, but there are a number of opportunities to move the ball forward. And you got to believe in yourself when those moments come up.
Yeah, thank you, Tyler, it's sometimes is a bitter pill to say that the best thing that you did was to stop some bad stuff. But it is true. There's bad legislation in Frankfurt and in every policymaking body. And sometimes it takes concerted effort, more effort to play defense. And sometimes, I think we underestimate sometimes how much education, how much awareness we bring when we have an offense on the board, on a bill, and we don't get it passed, but we come back the next year. In fact, I've had legislators be on panels with me where they have literally said to people, I don't pay attention to an issue until it's back by the second or third or fourth year, because then I know people are really serious about it. So think about that. And there are a lot of bills that come one time and we never see them again. So, legislators who have been around for a while really look for that persistence. And I think you have to have a certain degree of optimism, not rose-colored glasses, but at least optimism that, good policy will win out at some point. And my final point is it's really about relationships. If you only talk to your legislators during the heat of battle in Frankfurt and never any other time of the year, you're not going to have the kind of relationship that's really going to be effective. Invite them to your meetings in your community. Know when they're running for office to get reelected. Work with them like you would with any other person that you wanted to do business with, and think about it in terms of a relationship. So we know that advocacy can be focused at individual, community, state, or national level. And I always say to people, what's the policy you need to have changed and who has the power to change it? And I have seen people go after an issue at the state level that is a federal issue. And then they're upset when legislators say, well, we can't do that, not realizing why that is. Sometimes you take things to your local level and they say, our hands are tied by the state law. You're going to have to go to Frankfurt to do that. Who do the policymakers listen to? Look at who they are on committees with. See if you can find out what, if you go on the Legislative Research Commission website and look up legislators, they'll have their education. They graduated from Berea. Who do you know that graduated from Berea? They belong to the Rotary Club. Who do you know that belongs to the Rotary Club? I mean, that's the way you kind of get to know people and get to influence them. And then how do you become one of those people that can influence them? So your most powerful statements are, I am your constituent and I vote. And again, the power of the ballot box. You also can say, if you're working with a legislator who's not your legislator, but you do work in their district, and this is true more so for, I work with a lot of healthcare and mental health providers. But if you're working for a food bank, for instance, or you're working with a farm community that's in their district, they will listen to you. I work with your constituents, or we produce the food in your district, and here's where it is. So you can go to the LRC website, and I've got this later in the slides and on some of the handouts too. And it's very easy to put in your home address, and a little marker comes down, and you click on the marker, and up pops your House member and your Senate member. The only thing I would warn you is that some of them had their pictures taken when they first arrived in the legislature, and they've been there for 20 or 30 years, and they may look a little different than their picture. How do you make connections? You're better off making connections now before the session starts, because it gets really wild up there, and they have a million messages and emails and committee meetings and so forth. And then again, remember, it's a process and not a one-time deal. So we talked about leave behinds and that kind of thing. Kentucky Voices for Health used to do these wonderful policy briefs. They were 10 to 12 pages, and we had lots of graphs and pictures and that kind of thing. And we would lay out the research. Well, we don't do that anymore, because what we have found increasingly is you just can't get a legislator's attention for that long. You really want to talk about a fact sheet, a one-pager, at the most 2 pages. You want to use bullets. You want to use lots of white space. You want to use, if you could afford some color, that helps, some illustrations. Keep the reading level to a 6th grade level. And I'm not demeaning the legislators. I'm not saying they only have a 6th grade education. They want to be able to quickly scan and get the gist of it. You want to keep your messages consistent. So we do scripts on our messages to the message line. When I send out an action alert, I will say, ask for your message to go to the Senate Health and Welfare Committee. Here's the message, and it's 2 short sentences, or it's 1 short sentence, so that they're hearing the same words. from lots of people that call. It's very consistent. And then as your fact sheet as a leave behind, make sure you have your contact information on it. I cannot tell you how many times I've been in a legislator's office at the end of a long day, and they'll pick up something and say, this is an interesting piece. I have no idea who left it for me, and there's no contact information on it. Don't blow the opportunity. If you get their attention, you want to at least leave your email address on it. Phone number is even better. So you can engage in coalition building. And these can be formal. Our mental health coalition, as I said, is 40 years old, and we have bylaws and, you know, that kind of thing. We charge minimal dues for people to join, and we've been doing legislative priorities for 40 years because we wanted to bring together the entire mental health community, providers, hospitals, agencies, every kind of profession, the consumers of mental health services, and the family members like the National Alliance on Mental Illness, the NAMI folks. So we wanted all those people to be under one umbrella and come together again. Here's the agreement. Here's what we just finished this process in December. So now we're disseminating. Here's our priorities. Here's what we're going to be asking for in the budget, because this is a budget session. Sometimes those coalitions can be informal. They can be informal around a single issue, or sometimes around multiple issues. If you're building a coalition, think about who might be with us. You know, we very seldom in mental health think about the business community, but there have been some allies from the Chamber of Commerce, for instance, around some of the opioid problems, some of the substance use disorder treatment, around expunging criminal records. Why? You know, you think they're not mental health. Why do they do it? Because they need workers. And they want people to be able to work. And we've got a whole population, a big population of people that are tied up either in recovery programs or in jails and prisons, or can't get certain jobs because they have that record. So when we did our big push against the insurance companies to get coverage for mental health services, which they did not cover, some of our strongest allies were the faith community. And people would say to me, legislators would say, you know, my minister talked to me about this. What's the deal? Well, it's a social justice issue. Why should people with a brain disorder like schizophrenia not be able to get insurance coverage? It's absolutely a discrimination by the insurers. And those groups and groups like them would get on board because it was a social justice issue. So think outside the box a little bit in building support. Focus on those ultimate decision makers, the chairs of the committee, the leadership in the majority party in the House and Senate, and figure out who's connecting with them. And then Rich Seckel from Kentucky Equal Justice always talks about a drumbeat or a buzz. You know, keep your message and your issue out in the public as much as you can. Get some events together, get some free media that we talked about, so that you can generate more people, more sense of having everybody in Kentucky concerned about this, when actually it's not quite everybody in Kentucky, but you've built that buzz. So, you know, your voice is magnified when you're working in coalitions and partnerships. And if everybody's on the same message and aiming at the same target, you've got a better chance of catching policymakers' attention and then getting their support. So you want to put a face on the problem. Personal stories tell it best, but then do your homework, put those numbers behind it as well. So here's your story, and we know that this represents X number percentage of the population, or X number of neighborhoods in Louisville that are food deserts, those kinds of things. Little videos, if you can use them. And then again, that powerful ask, I'm your constituent, I have a problem and I need your help to solve it. And of course, those conversations need to be going on, hopefully before we get into session. So you can engage the community with rallies. I described the 874K. If you can't get at least 100 people in the rotunda, and with the session coming up, I don't know if they're even going to allow people in the rotunda. Another thing that we've learned over the years is you can have what's called a press conference and have a lot fewer people there, but still get to the press. So you can invite the press and set up in one of the rooms in the annex and have your legislators there and have your person who has the personal story and get 10 or 15 of your supporters to sit in the room, and then you've built kind of that press conference. We also are doing, and I think Kentucky Voices for Health has done some of these, you can do remote press conferences now with the Zoom, where we have people that are going to tell their story. We have some subject experts, we say the people that really know the data and so forth. And then we'll invite the press to come to the Zoom, and it's really a remote press conference. You can send out your calls to action or your action alerts. Come in. I'm on Zoom. Yeah, thank you, Kenny. Sorry, folks. That's the beauty of Zoom at home. So be real clear when you send out your action alerts. And a lot of people are doing that on Twitter now. They're using social media. That's another way to get to know your legislator. Follow them on their Facebook, follow them on their Twitter. You can find out a whole lot about them. I understand that some of the legislators are personal messaging people through social media and even setting up times to talk and appointments and so forth.
Yeah,
Phone
Sheila.
yeah.
Oh, I was going to add, at least if we're talking about state and local, these folks are far more accessible than at least I think I realized at one point. Once you get into federal, obviously, you know, like I don't run into Mitch McConnell very much at Kroger, but, you know, especially the House,
Yes.
the state House and state Senate, you know, I've direct messaged with legislators after just commenting on a tweet, and they, you know, went back and forth. Like, why do you, you know, some folks put to Sheila's point, their cell phone on the LRC website. Some do not. Some are much harder to get a hold of.
Right.
Some do not have Twitter, but many of them are not behind glass cases and are much more accessible than you would think.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true, Tyler. Thank you. And in fact, if you are not reaching out to them, sometimes they kind of get their feelings hurt. I think they feel like they've been snubbed or something, particularly in the minority party. They don't have quite as much to do, and they're very happy to talk with you and spend some time with you. I think, you know, obviously well-planned contacts and testimony. We have found it helpful over the years. Our mental health color is red. It's the color of passion and heart and the world is on fire kind of thing. And people have known us. It got a little bit cross purposes when the teachers all started wearing red. So we use less of it now. But to have an identifying slogan or color is helpful. And then again, utilizing the media, keep your story alive. Let's see where we are. So shifting the narrative is essentially reminding policymakers, here's what's going on now, and here's the change that we need. And I think we could do it this way. Sometimes you don't know what the solution is, and you just want to present the problem to them. What are we going to do about the fact that X, Y, and Z? Op-eds and letters to the editor, particularly to the small weekly community papers, I think are more often read, particularly out in the more rural areas. And again, try to use consistent messaging and phrasing in your communications. The emails to the LRC website or the LRC addresses, a lot of legislators just, it's a very bulky system for them. And apparently if they get too many in their inbox, it just shuts down the whole system. So it's difficult for them during the session. My tip is that if you have not reached out to your House member, your senator, send them an email to that LRC website that's on the, or email address that's on the website, and put in the subject line, I am your constituent. Now, don't do it to all 138 legislators, you'll lose your credibility, but do it to your senator and your House member. Tell them your home address, because I like to verify that, and then tell them why you want to be in touch with them. You know, I'm Sheila Schuster, I live in so-and-so and so-and-so in Louisville, Kentucky. I'm a psychologist, and I'm very concerned that we're not doing enough for people with severe mental illness. And I'd like to talk to you by phone, or we could set up a Zoom, or, you know, I'm going to be in Frankfurt, X, Y, and Z. Here's my contact information, including my cell phone number. So you want to make that connection and then give them a short ask. You don't want to put volumes in the email, or like it won't get read. So all politics are local. And I don't know whether that was Wendell Ford or whoever said that originally, probably a lot of people, but it really is true. The action may be taking place in Frankfurt, but it's the folks back home that, number one, get their attention. So never underestimate that. You may live in the furthest regions, east, west, north, south, and feel like you're forgotten in Frankfurt, but your local people will know you. And you get to know them, and you need to bring that local voice wherever you are. So let me go into the kind of Civics 101. This is actually a prettier view of the Capitol with the tulips and so forth. And again, I'm going to go through this fairly quickly just so that we can get to questions and so forth. The reason I always include this is that if you don't have an overall sense of how the process works, I think it's hard for you to understand, for instance, an action alert. So if I send out an action alert, and our bill is House Bill HB 123, and I send out an action alert and I say, call your senator and the Senate Health and Welfare Committee, you're going to think I have a typo, right? Because you're thinking, well, no, HB means it's a House bill and it's in the Senate, so it must be a Senate bill. No, the bill keeps the same number that it always has. So if it starts in the House, it's always going to be a House bill, no matter where it is in the process. The other piece of that is, if you know that our bill is House Bill 123 and you're real tight with your senator, and the first day of the session, you start badgering your senator about House Bill 123, he or she is going to get upset with you, because he or she can't do anything about that bill until it comes over to the Senate from the House. So sometimes people get put off by a legislator saying, well, where is it? And you're like, what does that mean? Or they may say to you, do we have it? And you're thinking, what does that mean? Well, what it means is, has it come over from the House to our Senate, where I can see it and where I may be on a committee that will vote on it, or at least I will see it when it comes to the floor of the Senate. So that's why I think it's so important for you to have just this overall sense of how it happens. So our issues are not partisan. Food security is not a partisan issue. Mental health is not a partisan issue. Merry Christmas. But the process is political. And that's why you need to know about the politics. So just remember that the party who holds the majority holds all the power. And in our case, if I were in person, I'd say, what party controls the House? And you would say, the Republican Party. And I said, you know, what party controls the Senate? You'd say the Republican Party. And then I'd say, well, what party controls the executive branch in the governor's office? The Democratic Party. So one of the variables going into the 2022 session is that fight, that tug of war, which has gotten more and more pronounced between the Republicans in the legislature and the Democrats in the executive branch. And a year from now, or, you know, in 2023, the governor will be running for re-election. So don't forget that, because everything that happens is tied up with elections. 2022 is an election year for all the House members and half the senators. So they want to be sure they don't get on the wrong side of a vote, or that they get stuck with a very controversial issue that might affect whether they get a challenger in the primary or whether it affects their getting reelected. And then once that's passed, they don't want to give the governor any victories. So just keep those things in mind. Those in leadership have great influence, as do the committee chairs. But it doesn't mean that you should ignore the Democrats, because they all have a vote and they all have a voice. And some of them are very good at working with the majority party, even brokering some deals with the majority party. So 38 members in the Kentucky Senate, 30 are Republicans, 8 are Democrats. We have a brand new Republican member who will be sworn in January, and it's Dr. Don Douglas from Jessamine County. He's a physician, anesthesiologist, and he was elected to fill the seat of Tom Buford, Senator Tom Buford, who passed away sadly earlier this year. The Senate president is Robert Stivers from Clay County. So think about that in the politics. He comes from Eastern Kentucky, and I believe Clay County is in the top 3 poorest counties in the United States. So he comes from Appalachia, he comes from poverty, he comes from a county that has incredibly high opioid problems. So you kind of see that in what he spends his time on. The minority leader is Morgan McGarvey, the Democrat from Louisville, who has announced that he is going to run for Congressman John Yarmouth's seat in Washington. In the House, we have 75 Republicans. 2 of them are new. One down in Taylor County, elected to fill the seat of John Bam Carney, who passed away earlier this year. And his name is, they call him Sarge. I've forgotten his first name. His last name is Pollock. And he is an insurance broker from Taylor County. The other one was elected to fill a seat that was left vacant when Robert Goforth resigned. And that's Rockcastle and part of Madison County. And his name is Tommy Truitt. And he is a school principal, but also his family has a big farm, apparently, a commercial farm in that district. And there are 25 Democrats. So the Speaker of the House is David Osborne from Oldham County. And the minority leader is Joni Jenkins from Louisville.
Ready to go. Good job. Nice thinking there, sis.
Real quick, Sheila, before you move on, I was just to make a note to circle back to what you had lifted up earlier. There's a lot of legislators, right? What is it, 138? If I'm
yes,
doing the math
138, right?
Hard to keep track of, especially recently in the past. I can't remember the number. In the past 2 election cycles, so I guess that'd be 4 years. We've had massive turnover in the General Assembly. Whole bunch of old timers retired or got defeated, a whole bunch of freshmen. I think it's over a third. It might be close to a half of the entire.
Right. It's at least a third in the House. Yeah, that's right.
So these are a lot of folks that even longtime lobbyists like Sheila or myself don't know very well. And there's a whole lot of opportunity to build relationships and also figure out where they stand on the issues, because we just don't know. We don't have the time to get into the factions and who is good on this issue. Right. But there are a number of resources within this network that do have some sense of some of that. So don't hesitate to reach out to Jessica or I if you have questions about whether it's your legislator or a specific issue, and try and triangulate the politics. I say that so that you're not overwhelmed by the prospect of trying to figure out, like Sheila, who has a Rolodex of the legislators in her mind.
I used to be better at it, but you're right about all the new ones. And I do think that's an important point. When you go on the LRC website to look up your legislator, when you get directed to that, or if you just go and start looking at some of the pictures and it'll tell you when they were elected. And so there was a huge onslaught that came in 2017, started in the 2018 session, and the same thing 2 years later. So Tyler's exactly right. And you will see a ton of those. One of the tricks of finding out what legislators are interested in is that you can go on that Legislative Research Commission website, and if you click on bills, you can go back, say, and look at the bills from, let's say, the 2021 session, so the last session. And you can look up either House bills or Senate bills. And then within that, you can look up bills by sponsor. And they will list every one of the 100 House, and they will list all of the bills that they were listed on. And the ones with the asterisk, they were a primary sponsor. In other words, they were the lead on that. And I think it's really helpful if you don't know anything about your legislator to go and look at that and click and see what your legislator took the lead on. What were those bills about? And then what was your legislator also a sponsor of, meaning they signed on in support of that bill? Will give you some sense. Also look at the committees they're on, because they do have some choice, not, the ones with less seniority, in other words, the newly elected have less choice about what committees they're on. The older, more senior legislators get to the committees they want to be on. But if your legislator is on the education committee, that's a tough committee to get on. That means they really want to be on education. So think about that in terms of your issue. If your legislator is on appropriations and revenue, which is probably the hardest committee to get on because that's the money committee, they have some in with the leadership in their party and are not a committee chair. So you can learn a lot about your legislator just in terms of that kind of background research as well. This gives you some idea about the schedule. So we go in on the 4th. Right now, the candidate filing deadline to run in the 2022 elections is January 7th. They will have to change that because they haven't approved the new maps for redistricting on the basis of the 2020 census. So people really don't know what district they're running in. So we think what's going to happen is they're going to have to pass those maps the first week of the session, and probably at the same time, they will delay that filing deadline to probably later in January. One of the things that happens with the filing deadline is that the rule of thumb is no legislator wants to take a bad vote or a controversial vote before the filing deadline, because what they're afraid of is that somebody in their own party will challenge them in the primary. In other words, will get mad about a vote that they took and said, well, we can't have somebody representing us who believes X, Y, and Z, so I'm going to run for office against them. Or it may generate opposition from the other party. So we always say very little gets done in Frankfurt before the filing deadline. And if they move it later in January, we won't see as many more controversial issues come up until after that filing deadline.
And coincidentally enough, the filing deadline used to be January 28th, and they were accused, just like Sheila said, of doing nothing except, naming bridges and kissing babies for the whole week of January. Yeah. They just, in the past year or two, moved it to the 7th, and now they're going to have to move it back.
Move it back. Yeah, exactly. It's kind of ironic. They will take off on these 2 holidays. So just to have that in your calendar. The last day for bill requests means that that's the very last day that a legislator can signal that they're going to file a bill that they're going to sponsor. So if you're scrambling around in February, mid-February, trying to find a bill sponsor or trying to get the language together, concentrate on getting a sponsor so they can put in a bill request and then worry about the language later. And sometimes the smarter legislators will actually put in for a couple of bill requests just to hold them, to make sure they have them in case they want to file something. And then shortly after that is the last day to introduce new House bills. So again, if you've got a new issue you've got a sponsor, you've got to have that language approved and ready for them to take to the desk essentially when they convene on February 28th, or else that bill is not going to be considered in the session. And then a few days later is the last day to introduce new Senate bills. Concurrence days are and we'll explain this a little bit more later. This is when you have a bill. Let's go back to our House Bill 123. So the House passes it and it goes over to the Senate, and the Senate says, because the Senate always says they're smarter than the House and know better and are the more diplomatic and form of government. So they will say, well, we've improved your bill. We passed House Bill 123, but we put some amendments in it. So you now have two different versions of House Bill 123, and you can't have that because then there's a fight about which one goes to the governor for signature and so forth. So then starts what I call the Mother May I part. That's the concurrence. So the Senate sends back their version to the House and they say, we improved your bill. So will you concur or agree to just use our version? Well, the House started the bill, the primary sponsors in the House, and almost always the House says no and hell no. And they send it back to the Senate and say, you need to recede or back off what you put in there. And very seldom does that happen. So we're still at this standoff. So they appoint a conference committee that meets for 5 minutes and they say, we can't come to an agreement. And then the really scary part starts because they go into what they call free conference committee. So you have House and Senate, Ds and Rs, people that were pro the bill and people that were opposed, and they put them all behind closed doors. And the rule is that they could do whatever they agree to. They could completely revamp the bill. So it's really a scary time to be an advocate. It's even a scarier time to be a lobbyist because you're up there sending thought waves through the door and hoping that they remember what the bottom lines are, what things you just cannot live with and the changes. In all the years I've been up there, only once has a bill come out of free conference committee that so distorted what we wanted to start out with that I asked the bill sponsor in the originating House to have that chamber not approve the conference committee report. And we lost the bill. I mean, the bill was dead after that, which is really hard to go back and explain to people that your bill actually passed both the House and the Senate, but you don't have a final bill to go to the governor's office. In most cases, they come up with something that both the House and the Senate agree. So you only have one version of House Bill 123. After they do that, they go into the veto days, because at that point, the governor has all of the bills and he can do, or she can do one of three things. Sign it within 10 days, let it sit there for 10 days and become law without their signature, which is kind of their way of saying, I really don't like this bill, but I don't dislike it enough to veto it, or they can veto it. And vetoes right now have almost no meaning because it only takes a simple majority of the House and Senate to override a veto. So one of the things that the legislature wants to do is to make sure they've done all their business so that there aren't any bills that they pass after the veto days. And in the 2021 session, they did pass a couple of things in the final day or 2 days of the session. The governor vetoed them, and then they had no ability to override the vetoes. So they will come back for a 59th day on April 13. And actually on April 14, they have the ability to override vetoes. And you saw some really ugly non-democratic actions, I think, particularly in the House, where they limited debate on every one of these veto bills to 15 minutes for the entire group of Democrats to raise any objections and so forth. It got pretty ugly. By Constitution, they have to adjourn by April 15th. If you look at the calendar, April 15th is Good Friday this year. So they actually are ending earlier. They're not cutting down the number of days, but they are going to end by midnight on April 14th. And just a reminder, if you're going to come to Frankfurt, the best days to come are Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays. Remember, we still have a part-time legislature. So they travel up on Monday, they go into session at 4 o'clock on Mondays. And on Fridays, they go into session at either 9 or 10, and then they go home. So you don't have really full days except on Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays. So a piece of legislation can only become law if it's passed by both the House and Senate in the same form, signed by the governor. I remind you that you can only pass legislation when they're in session. So when they have these interim meetings that they've been having all summer, people sometimes say, well, they didn't take a vote. Well, they can't vote on anything in the interim. I mean, they can vote on a report from a task force or whatever, but they can't pass legislation or change legislation. Bills can be a single line or they can be hundreds of pages. And I put that in there because lots of folks over the years have said to me, well, this will be easy to pass because it's just this one sentence we're changing. And I'm like, it's still the same process. You still have to take it step by step through the committees and through both chambers. So it may be easier in terms of whether legislators read it or not. So they meet every year. You all may remember that before 2000, they met every other year. So they met 60 days every other year. When I moved to Kentucky in 1970, I was told that we would be better off if they met 2 days every 60 years. I think that's fine if you're playing defense all the time. If you're playing offense, biennial sessions were really tough because you would get close to passing something and then you'd have a 2-year wait until you had to come back. So the re-education part of that was really tough. Since 2001, we've been doing this odd numbered sessions for 30 days. I always say every session is odd, but the odd numbered years, you do a 30-day session, even numbered, you do a 60. Only the governor can call a special session. You see in other states, and there's been some talk here of trying to change that, but it would have to be changed in the Constitution where the legislators want to be able to call themselves into special session. And I don't know if you remember, but the special session in September was very specific to the COVID issue and with certain parameters. It was unusual because it's the only special session that I'm aware of where the governor who called the session ended up vetoing several of the bills that were passed because they ended the mask mandate and the vaccine requirement and so forth, which is what he had put in his executive orders.
Sheila, real quick, I just wanted to respond to Lori's question about when does pre-filing happen and what does it mean to advocates?
Yeah, pre-filing is going to end this Friday coming up. And so if you go on the website, you can click on all the bills that are pre-filed. And I think there's maybe 40 or so, maybe 50. There's a lot of, there's a range of opinion about what pre-filing. Some legislators will say, I never pre-file. I just don't do it. I don't believe in it. Others will say, if I've got an issue that's fairly complex and I want to educate people about it before we get into session, and I've brought it up in the interim and talked about it, I'd like to get my bill out there so that people have a chance to really see what I'm talking about in the bill language. So those bills have what they call a BR number on them, a bill request number. That was the request number that the legislator got when they said to the LRC, I want to draft something, so just give me a BR. That they still are not introduced until we go into session. And then there's a formality where they bring forward those BRs and they will be converted into either an HB, a House bill, if the sponsor is a member of the House, or a SB Senate bill if the sponsor is a member of the Senate. So I'm of a mind that pre-filing doesn't really get you any place. unless you're using it for educational purposes. Sometimes people will do it when they've had a bill in the previous session and it's not passed, and it's kind of their way of saying, we're bringing this back and here it is.
The other thing that I would add to that is that it is an opportunity to work with the legislator to actually take a very rough draft thing and turn it into something more formal. Because to Sheila's point, like it's a pressure cooker up there. Come, when they gavel in, the pressure just builds and builds and builds. I actually meant to mention this in the timeline. But, there is, depending on if it's short or long, between 600 and 1,000 bills that can be submitted in a single session. 80 to 90% of those are passed within the last 2 to 3 working days of the session. So there's a lot of talk, a lot of posturing, a lot of back and forth at the beginning, and then it's just bam, bam, bam. They will just start moving bills through. And if you try and bring a new issue that hasn't been mulled over, whether it's by the constituents or by the legislator, or actually have the LRC staff write it, because most legislators don't write anything.
Right.
They hand a piece of paper to a legislative research staffer and say, here's 3 bullet points. I want you to turn it into a bill. So yeah, that's the only addendum. And then Sheila, I did just want to do a quick time check. It's 3:15.
Should we have ended by now?
No, we have 15 more minutes.
Okay,
But
all right, I'm gonna talk, I'll talk fast. Thank you. So 60-day session coming up, they've got to do a budget, and I think we all agree, when you set your budget at home, you're setting your priorities. And I've been through a lot of budget sessions, and I'm still waiting for the people of Kentucky to be at the top of the priority list. They will also have to do the district maps and set a new filing deadline. We talked a little bit about that. So the state has more money available than ever before, probably more requests. The Republicans are taking the position that we really don't have that money. It's one-time only money. That would be the ARPA, or the American Rescue Plan money. And they're talking tax cuts, which we really don't want, because we're not always going to have that federal money, and it's going to cut into the revenue going forward. So I think that our message is the rainy day is kind of like the savings account. And right now, as the Kentucky policy people have reported, Jason Bailey, Dustin Pugel, and so forth, we've got 3 times, 4 times, 5 times as much money in the rainy day fund that they put in last session than we've ever had. And it's raining right now, folks. So our message is the people's needs, we're getting rained on. It's a veritable storm, and we really need that money to be spent. There'll be still attention on COVID-related issues. I think there'll still be fights over the masks and the vaccines and so forth. There's going to be a ton of fighting over the healthcare workforce shortages and how to address that. And I think generally, I think the Republicans are acting like, oh, we're not in a pandemic and the doors will be open and the public is welcome. I don't know how long that will last, depending on, a lot of the counties in Kentucky are in the red right now on COVID. So I think there's issues there. I'm not sure that the governor is going to allow anything to happen in the rotunda, for instance, and he controls that. So stay tuned. I don't think we'll be entirely remote like we were last session. So legislating public policy is not always a logical and rational process. I wish it were. And just remember that those who love sausage and the law should watch neither being made. Obviously, you can have really good sausage if you put in really good stuff, and the same is true of law, but the process is not pretty. So a bill gets introduced, and remember the bill is given an HB or an SB, depending on whether your sponsor is a House member or Senate, keeps that same number all the way through. Goes to a committee, and one of the things that you think about and you want to work with leadership about is sometimes it's not clear which committee. You could go to licensing and occupations, for instance, or to health and welfare. And sometimes you have a preference in terms of where you think it's more likely that you can get your bill voted out. So if you have a sponsor who's very tied into leadership of their party. It's real helpful to have that discussion. Often the leadership will decide or help the chair decide if the bill ever gets heard and voted on. So Tyler mentioned that, so many of the bills are passed in the last few days, which is absolutely true. The total number of bills that are passed is probably 15% of those, 20% at the most of those that are filed. And you say, well, boy, all those bills went down in defeat. Well, they didn't. They never got heard. They were never assigned to a committee, which was the tactic that the Republicans took this last session. And 95% of the democratically sponsored bills never were assigned to a committee, so they were never going to have a chance to be heard. It's very rare for a bill actually to be voted down in a committee. They don't like their members to have to cast a bad vote, so they would rather not hear it than to have that happen. Committee meetings are open to the public, but the rule of thumb here is you really have to work the committee before that happens. So when I send out action alerts, I send out the list of the members of the committee. I'll say, call the message line 1-800-372-7181, ask for your message to go to the entire Senate Health and Welfare Committee. If your senator is on that committee, get in touch with them. If your senator is not on that committee, but you have a good relationship with the senator, you can call your senator and say, I know you're not on health and welfare, but if you've got some good friends on health and welfare, I'd love for you to put in a good word on our bill. I've talked to you about this bill before, and they will do that. Educate them before that, let them know how you feel about it. We use our color, we show up in red, we make signs, it's real cheap to print them off on mailing labels. And, you wear a catchy sign and it kind of swells those numbers again. And most of the time a bill can be killed when a committee chair doesn't call it for a hearing. Sometimes a committee chair will say to a lobbyist or an advocate, are you sure it's going to vote? Tell me who you've gotten commitments from, because I'm not going to call this unless I'm sure that the bill's going to pass in my committee. And so you really need to make the rounds. That's what the whips do. The whips are elected by their parties for their caucus, and they literally whip or count the votes on important issues. The bill, after it comes out of committee, gets its first reading, it gets published in the legislative record, it's placed on the calendar for the following day. The second day, it gets another reading, and the floor amendments may be filed. So this is where it gets scary. If there are a lot of negative floor amendments, because you have to start preparing your bill sponsor to as to how to beat back the amendments, what the arguments would be. Sometimes the bill is sent by the Rules Committee to another committee. And if that happens, that's their way of saying, we don't like your bill. And even though it passed this committee, we're going to send it to, there sometimes is what they call a graveyard committee. It's usually appropriations and revenue. Otherwise, it's going to be heard on the next day. The majority floor leader makes a motion. The bill sponsor speaks for or against it. You're up in the gallery sweating bullets. I always wish I had a tin can with the wire down to the ear of the bill sponsor to answer questions and so forth, or could sail little airplanes down with messages. So the vote's taken, the bill passes. The Schuster rule is that you celebrate every good thing that happens to your bill. So it gets assigned to a good committee, it gets out of committee, it gets to the floor of the House, it passes the House. Don't celebrate too much though, because you got to do it again. So here's our friends, Senator Julie Rocky Adams and Senator Hornback conferring on the floor of the Senate. So you get it out of the Senate. Now it's going to go over to the House, and you've got to go through that same process. You've got to work with leadership. You've got to get it to a good committee. It usually will go to the same committee that it went to in the other chamber, but not necessarily. You want to be sure that it gets voted on by that committee, gets its readings, and has its final passage. So again, we talked about concurrence, got to have the same form of the bill, and you've got to work that out. and then it goes to the governor. I've only had one bill ever be vetoed by a governor. Unfortunately, it was a bill I had spent 5 years passing. So to say I was blown away would be an understatement. It was a mental health bill called Tim's Law, and Governor Bevin, I think, was given really bad advice. He had just come into office and he vetoed it, even though we were working with his office to have a celebration when he signed it, because we had no idea he was going to veto it. Fortunately, my sponsor was Julie Rocky Adams, and she's powerful in the Senate, and she texted me and said, we're going to fight it. So we generated probably 1,000 calls over the next 2 days. There were only 2 days left in the session. 1,000 calls to the message line. I had 50 people in red standing up there. I had Tim's mom and his sister up there to meet every senator who went in, because I wanted them to know this is a real life person who died because we didn't have a system in place. And they overrode his veto. And then the House did it. So we had a hell of a celebration party, and we did not invite the governor to it. A bill becomes law 90 days after, unless it has an emergency clause, in which case it becomes effective as soon as it's signed. So just a couple of wrap up things. Identify your senator or representative, go to the website, put in your home address, contact them at home, especially before the session, identify yourself as a constituent. Contact them in Frankfurt, message line. There's a handout I have where you could call their office, 502-564-8100. They have a receptionist that they share with other legislators, but that receptionist is usually very good at getting a message. And if you tell the receptionist that you're a constituent, they will try even harder to get the message to them. The message line, those people are wonderful. The switchboard, it takes about 3 minutes to get signed up initially. And then after that, every time you call, you give them your name and your phone number, and they pull it up and they'll say, who do you want the message to go to and what's your message? And you want to make that short. Use your bill number. If you can't remember it, look it up before you call, because there's so many bills. Sometimes the switchboard, if they have been getting a lot of calls about a certain bill, can even help you with that. And then you can follow the action. You can follow every bill on the website to see where it is, what the vote was, and so forth. 2022 is an election year. All 100 state house seats could be on the ballot, half of the Senate seats. Follow the candidate filing. So again, we'll know when the deadline is, so you know who is running. Offer to help your legislators get reelected or help a challenger get elected. You will be remembered for your help. That is one way to really get in good with a legislator, is to walk the district for them, give them some money. It's expensive to run these campaigns. Sit down and address postcards, answer phones. There's just lots and lots of things you can do. And register to vote. Remember that elections have consequences. Stay informed. I suggest Kentucky Voices for Health, which tracks all of these. There's Tyler's email address. Be positive, be polite, but always be persistent. And if you give up, they're going to think your issue is not important. Remember your local people. My hallmark in Frankfurt has been that I always write personal thank you notes to any legislator who meets with us or helps us out. And they really appreciate it. Remember, they are part-time and they're not getting rich doing this. Reach out and educate others who can help, and believe that your voice can really make a difference, because it absolutely can. And then I'll leave you with this, which is my favorite quote of all time. Never forget that a small group of thoughtful people could change the world. Indeed, that's all that ever has. And I think we have that kind of group of thoughtful world changers here. So I'm gonna stop the share and see if we have any questions that we haven't answered. Tyler.
Yeah, thank you, Sheila. Just a couple quick logistical notes. There's a bunch of great handouts that encapsulate some of what Sheila went over. We'll also send that out with the recording. So if you think you didn't take extensive enough notes, don't panic. There will be good materials going out. I also just put the involvement survey for the Kentucky Food Action Network, just if you're not already plugged in, if you found your way here through some way other than being in the listserv, please do fill that out so we can follow up with you afterwards. And with that, we only have a couple minutes left, but I welcome any questions. Like I said, I mean, Sheila likely has gone through it, whatever the scenario is.
Whatever the scenario is. Well, I'll tell you my favorite story if we have time. Is there anything in the chat?
Nothing extensive. Also, just a quick plug, we will be going a lot more into the food, farm, and feeding specifics of this. This was obviously Advocacy 101, but you know, we'll dig into the ag committees and all the other parts of advocacy that we didn't get a chance to get into today. So but yeah, unless there's a question, Sheila, please.
In 2000, we decided to redo the insurance law about paying for mental health services. So it's this little band of mental health advocates against every insurer in the state, literally. And of course, everybody said, you know, it can't be done. And there are lots of funny stories about this, but you know, our House bill was House Bill 268. So we had a slogan, House Bill 268, do not discriminate. Our color was red. We rented a bus and parked it between the Capitol and the Annex with a huge sign that said House Bill 268, do not discriminate. All of this stuff, we get it through the House, we get over to the Senate. It's the first year the Republicans are in charge. And by and large, the Republicans are business people and they love insurance companies. And everybody said there is no way in H that you're going to get this passed. So the chair of the committee went to Health and Welfare for some reason, was Julie Denton. And she said, no, my leadership is telling me I can't hear this, I can't hear this, I can't hear this. And finally, we just so harassed her nicely, but persistently. And she finally said, do you have the votes in committee? And I said, yes. And I brought her the roster of the committee and who had said yes. And we had the votes to pass it. And she said, all right, I've got one last committee meeting before the session ends, and I'll put you on the agenda. And so we were on the agenda. And of course, what happens at the end of the session is that everybody's trying to get bills passed at the last minute. So two of our yes votes were in other committees testifying on their bills, and we're trying to get people in. So Julie very kindly is putting us later and later into the agenda. One of the people comes back and we're at the end of the agenda and she says to me, I got to call your bill. And I'm thinking, we're one vote short. But I said, you know, so she calls it, we testify and so forth. And I'm looking up and there's one legislator that I'm pretty sure is a no. He's a Republican. He never understood the bill. And I thought, you know, and I look out in the audience and his constituent of his is sitting in the audience. And I go over to the guy and I said, you've got to come up and testify. And he said, he's in his farm clothes, literally. He has a son with a serious mental illness. And he said, I can't do that. I'm scared to death. I said, just go up so he knows you're here for whatever good it is. I said, just tell him you have a son. This is going to help you. And honest to God, he came up there and I felt so bad because here I am, a psychologist, and he is shaking. I mean, he's so anxious that I'm thinking I'm producing an anxiety reaction. I'm supposed to be curing those. And he sits there and he's shaking and he says, I have a son with a mental illness and this would really help him. And he looks up and he looks right at his senator and he said, Senator, if you want your yard sign in my yard again, you'll vote for this bill. Well, it was the senator that I needed. So everybody in the place is going, oh, what a brilliant strategy, Sheila. And I said, so when they came around to take the vote, they called this senator and he said, I want to explain my vote, which always means they're voting no and they're justifying it. And I thought, well, we're still lost. And he said, I was going to vote no on this because I never did understand it. But he looked out in the audience and he said, Chet, this vote's for you. And I vote yes. And that was the vote that we needed to get out of committee. And we passed that bill in the Senate, again, because a constituent had emailed the majority floor leader and said, you've got to hear this bill. I thought the democracy was about the voice of the people. And he convinced the Senate president to call the bill, and we got the bill out. I mean, it really was a David and Goliath story. And it's really because those constituents had those connections. And that's what it takes. it takes a relationship, a willingness to know who your legislators are and to have a relationship with them. They're looking
Thank you.
for that.
Thank you so much. That's a great way to end this first in our 6-part series. So thank you, Sheila, immensely.
Absolutely. And
thank you.
I'm available, if people, and if we are up there in person, I'm up there certainly Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. So look for me. I'm usually in red.
Yes. Yep. And I know if I have a question, I'll probably be turning to Sheila at some point over the next 4 months. So
Absolutely.
we're a couple minutes over time, so we'll go ahead and end it there. If there were any questions, happy to forward those to Sheila. If we can't answer them ourselves, we'll send out the materials and a follow-up, and we hope to see many of you at the future trainings, which again, one next week, Thursday, same place, same time. We'll take a 2-week break and then start again in January. So thank you,
Well, and
everyone.
thank you all for putting this together, Jessica and Tyler. This is fabulous. And thank you all for attending. I'm really proud of you as advocates. I look forward to working with you.
Thank you, Sheila, and thanks everybody for being here.
All right.
See you
Bye-bye.
soon.